Well, I'm going to start with a hello and welcome, but I will take a moment or two just for folks who are joining us to be able to come through the doorway of our virtual session today. Okay. So I think as I see this happening, we'll be ready to move on. One more moment. I'm just checking out one other view here. Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone who's able to join us today, and welcome to our keynote panel, Interrogating the Origins of Restorative Justice. I'm Mary Jo Hebling, and I'm the Dean of Continuing Education here at the IIRP Graduate School. I'm co-facilitating this panel discussion today, and I'd like to pass it on to my colleague and co-facilitator and friend, Pat, to take a moment to introduce herself.
Thank you, Mary Jo. I'm Pat Lewis. I serve as the Executive Director of IIRP Canada, and I am a third-generation settler of British descent, coming to you today from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is governed by or covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. Such a pleasure to be with you all today, panelists and everyone who has joined us.
Thank you, Pat. Indeed, it's a pleasure for all of us, both of us, to be here today, because we bring together scholars and practitioners and friends. So our esteemed panelists include today Christiane Perez, Siddiqui Mohammed, Kay Pranis, and Iman Shabazz. Christiane Perez is Ilocano and Kapampangan, originally from the Ilocos region of the Philippines. She currently resides as an uninvited guest and immigrant settler on the unceded ancestral and traditional lands of the Coquitlam peoples of British Columbia, Canada. With over 25 years' experience in the restorative justice field, she is an accomplished facilitator with expertise in a variety of practice models, including victim offender dialogue, family group counseling, and peacemaking circles. She is currently the executive director of Restorative Justice Association in BC, and she is co-founder of Roots, Reclaiming Our Own Truths and Stories, an organization dedicated to anti-racism work in restorative justice and community spaces. Siddiqui Mohammed is the architect and lead specialist for the Student Champion Program with ACOBEN, a history teacher in alternative education, and is currently pursuing his PhD in Africology at Temple University. He is deeply interested in the indigenous African origins of restorative practices, exploring how these traditions promote healing and community resilience. He believes that understanding these roots can enrich contemporary approaches to justice and conflict resolution. Kay Pranis teaches and writes about the dialogue process known as peacemaking circles. From 1994 to 2003, Kay held the position of restorative justice planner at the Minnesota Department of Corrections. Since the initial exposure to the use of peacemaking circles in the criminal legal system, Kay has been involved in developing the use of peacemaking circles in schools, social services, victim support, churches, families, neighborhoods, museums, universities, municipal planning, and workplaces. Since 2003, Kay has been an independent trainer sharing the peacemaking circle process. And before anything, Iman Shabazz is son, elder brother, uncle, cousin, friend, and father figure to many children of the family and communities to which he belongs. Iman delivers practical solutions to complex problems, shares informed, inspiring perspectives, and has dynamically empowering effect on the people he reaches. He's proud to serve with this distinguished guests of this panel today. At this time, we'd like to remember a generous friend, Ali Gohar. Ali was a noted scholar and restorative justice expert from Pakistan. He was the founder and executive director of Just Peace Initiatives. He had accepted our invitation to contribute to today's panel, but sadly, he passed away in September. He was a light to the world and is already greatly missed. May we pause for a moment in his memory. Thank you. Pat?
Just keep that mute button under control. As our conversation today unfolds, we're going to be enriched by the panel's expertise in diverse applications of restorative justice practice as they deepen our understanding of the origins of restorative justice practice and of the colonization of this work by Western systems. Our guests will critically engage in the ways that practitioners can seek to decolonize their practice to honor the alignment of restorative practices with Indigenous and non-Western cultures. It's our responsibility as we do this work to be purposeful about the reparative actions we must take as individuals and as institutions. So to our panelists now, as we had talked earlier, our intention is for this to be, somewhat structured in that we have some questions planned, but also conversational. If you'd like to respond to what one of your colleagues has shared, that is perfectly fine with Mary Jo and I. So we are going to start today, Christiane, with you. And the first question will go in the order of Christiane, then Kay, then Aman, then Siddiqui. And the question is, share with us how you came to this work.
Agyamanaken, thank you. Naimbag nga aldaw gegayem ken kabagyan. Asyak ni Christian Paras. Good day, friends and relatives. As I've been introduced, my name is Christiane Paras. A little bit more about me. I'm Ilocano from my mother's side and Kampangpangan from my father's side. And originally from the northern Ilocos region of the Philippines, which for folks that don't know Philippine history, is its colonial name. It's named after King Philip II of Spain when we were occupied and I guess discovered. A crucial aspect of my identity is also as an immigrant settler of color, living and working on the traditional stolen lands of the Quiquitlam peoples where I currently reside and where I'm calling in from right now. I share who I am and my journey to these stolen lands because it is central to how I came to the work of restorative justice. As a young racialized immigrant, I was seeking community and grappling with what it means to be Filipino and Canadian. This led to learning the importance of honoring the land and the Indigenous people on this land that I have the privilege to now call home and to interrogate the tension that I was feeling, even as a young child, that this is not my home, as I am only a guest here. So this really led me to reflecting on my relationship with the Indigenous folks here on Turtle Island and my own people, keeping my relations back home and connecting to the community that is here. The question that really kind of led me to looking and finding restorative justice was, how do I find connections and grow here in this place while holding on to my ties to my homelands, my people, my language, and our ways of being that I value. So that is a really big foundational piece of how I found myself in this work. This became an incredibly important journey and practice to acknowledge the complex layers of identity that I hold and in my practice and my work in justice. As a person of color settler coming from a land that has its own history of colonization, now living here on Turtle Island with this history of colonization and present day oppression of Indigenous peoples, constantly examining the complex and dynamic layers of identity, the intersections of trauma and shame and identity at the intergenerational historical level, but also when harm and conflict occurs. And it's a both and, it's never an and or, a both and, not an either or. And so for me, I guess what's been driving my work since the beginning is how identity and intersections of identity the intersections of harm and conflict, the intersection of shame and trauma, how those are acknowledged or left unacknowledged in restorative justice spaces and processes. Again, and thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. And I'm coming from Minnesota, the land of Dakota people and Anishinaabe people. My coming to this work was entirely accidental. I didn't find restorative justice. It kind of found me. I was having trouble finding a job, and I took a job with a nonprofit to do criminal justice legal system policy work. Knew nothing about the criminal legal system and didn't have any particular interest, but it was the only job that was available to me. In that job, I stumbled onto the restorative justice philosophy as it was expressed by Howard Zehr in 1989. So it was before his book. It was pamphlets published by the Mennonite Central Committee. I resonated deeply to that vision, and it aligned with something that I had come across earlier in my job, and that was an article by Kay Harris that was a feminist vision of justice. Both visions describe the kind of world I wanted to live in. And the restorative justice vision, its articulation was one that I can imagine marketing in the US, where you cannot market anything with a feminist label at a policy level. And so that RJ articulation became the central organizing principle of my work, and then evolved pretty significantly when I learned the peacemaking circle process, which introduced me to a worldview different from the one that I had been raised with, that has become such an important part of my understanding of my work. And my sense of my work has evolved from that initial RJ framework to it being about the creation of a culture of peace. And that's where I sit today in terms of what the work means to me. It's about creating a culture of peace. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes,
Kay.
thank you both. I think for me, I've got both what I would consider to be an unconscious answer to that question and then a conscious answer to the question. As a man of African descent and thinking about the reality of the varied traditional cultures throughout the history of African peoples, there's a way of being born, if you will, into a cultural structure that incorporates this work, whether we know it, you know what I mean, so to speak, or not directly. And because of that, it's one of the things that I claim firmly in what I understand in terms of the traditions that I adhere to now. I directly am Akan, and I identify, if you will, for all relative purposes with Akan traditional culture, and coming to understand the ways in which we come together in community, where we strengthen community, and of course, where we resolve, for all relative purposes, the issues of community, has become foundational in my understanding, if you will, of how I move through applying this work, with the very communities that I work with today. In a conscious context, what I'd say is that when I was a teenager, I was a part of what's called the Richmond Peace Education Center here in Richmond. Peace, Raw. I see that pop up. Saw that pop up in the chat. As a teenager, I was a part of what was called the Richmond Peace Education Center, where we, thought that we were doing a lot of different important things, if you will, as teens to quote unquote save the world. And part of that work involved both peacemaking and conflict resolution. And the way that we were introduced to that work as we start applying it to things like undoing racism and sexism, as we started applying it to things like, at least for teens, self-esteem and awareness and understanding, if you will, how, if you will, to engage, if you will, in those things in the culture of the colonized, we utilized various restorative practices tools that were not necessarily taught in that specific manner, but that I've come to understand and put them, if you will, in a fuller context in terms of their utilization. And so that's work that I carried with me, if you will, on into my adult organizing work, where as I started working with community members and started really figuring out how do we struggle, how do we wrestle with these things that are impacting us, why we are still living under racialized oppression, and enduring, if you will, the ongoing impact of colonization. It gave me grounding, if you will, and a framework for which to really be able to say, hey, let's try some of these things in order to be able to deal with the internal issues that we have, and then start figuring out where these things lead to the appropriate empowerment for us to then, for our other purposes, decolonize, deconstruct, destroy, whatever it is that we're aiming to do, in terms of these very systems and structures, if you will, that are in place that are impacting us. And so those are the things that I'll start. That's where I'll start, excuse me, at least in terms of my entryway into the work. I've had varied levels, if you will, of training and certification, of course, along the way in relationship to all of that. Some of it related to EMU, Kay, from where I know you have affiliation as well, and others, excuse me, related to, for other purposes, reclaimed, if you will, indigenous practice. And the more I have grown to learn about our ways of dealing with building community, strengthening community, and healing community as African people, the more I've began to shift my understanding, if you will, of how then to take that information into the realm of truly being able to build community and to heal and to restore what needs to be restored, most primarily, excuse me, for us.
Thank you to everybody that has spoken before me. I am honored by sharing this space with you. And I'd also like to express acknowledgements to my family, who is directly responsible for my creation and my being here. My friends, those who have lost and those who are still here with us, as they have contributed to my emotional health and stability, and to the ancestors for all their strength. It is upon their shoulders that I stand. To the IIRP, who has organized and facilitated this wonderful event and asking this very important question and interrogating the origins of restorative practices. To the Creator, who has allowed and given us the gift of life and allowed for all of us to be here. And finally, to myself for being able to be here. So in my own journey, I came to this work through sort of a bi-directional engagement with the restorative paradigm and the Afrocentric paradigm. In 2012, my father, Dr. Malik Muhammad, the founder and CEO of Aquabin LLC, he established a Black-owned organization that was committed to the restorative transformation of Black and Brown communities across the nation. On the other hand, to also give credibility to my mother, Dr. Christina Watlington, she's also a licensed psychologist with a specialization in trauma-informed care. It should be noted that both of my parents were also members of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the AAPRP, not the AARP, which is designed for elders, but the AAPRP, which has done work directly with Kwame Ture in the 1990s. And hence, under their tutelage, I was able to learn both about my cultural identity as well as being able to amass these tools to vocalize my own emotional vocabulary. As I matriculated through Hampton University in the history department and later, yes, indeed, Mike, and later Temple University through the Africology program, I had began to identify there was a correlation that exists between culturally affirming scholarship within the Afrocentric paradigm and the socially regenerative work of the restorative paradigm. And I noticed there was complementarity between these two paradigms, and I noticed that I was uniquely situated between them, which has sort of become fundamental to my own research and investigations into the ancestral techniques and traditions of conflict resolution. So in other words, to echo the words much like Kay, I did not come directly into this work, but rather it came to me. And in many ways, it has molded how I communicate both as a son, as a brother, as a nephew, as a friend, and as of last week, a fiance. So yes.
Congratulations on that last news. Thank you. Thank you all. So we'll move to our second question now, and our order will be Kay, we'll start with you, and then to Siddiqui, and then Christian, and then Iman. The second question is, what is your perspective of the origins of restorative justice practices and how they've been portrayed in media, in trainings, etc.?
Congratulations, Siddiqui. That's sweet news to hear. And appreciation for all of the words that all of you have shared. I see the origins of this work as very diffuse, that there isn't a point source. The core ideas are ancient and found in many wisdom traditions, and in indigenous teachings. The circle, the process that I'm most familiar with, has direct roots among various indigenous peoples in North America, and is also found around the globe. So it, not unique to North America. The adaptation of these core ideas, which are very, very old in processes, in the modern multicultural society, I think has been influenced by multiple change movements. So the Native rights movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, human rights movement, the alternative dispute resolution movement, mindfulness movement, the body-mind awareness, and many more. I think that there are so many initiatives happening around the globe today, all rooted in these ancient ideas and all reaching for an evolutionary jump in consciousness. And so it is this, I see this connection between the very, very old roots and this modern desire for human beings to become more of their potential going forward. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kay, for speaking and beginning this question and conversation. I have a lot of thoughts around the subject, so please, y'all bear with me. So on the origins of restorative practices in academia, we discuss the distinction between a monogenetic origin, meaning to originate from one source, and a polygenetic origin, which is to originate from multiple sources. So as we continue to discuss restorative practices, I believe it's imperative that we acknowledge the universal application of it across time and space. Several cultures in this world have engaged variants of the restorative model. And among the Abenaki people, the original inhabitants of New England, there are traditions of people sitting in circle with an audience of community members and using a talking piece while practicing deep listening. In India, the Vedic texts evidence usage of a mediation to resolve disputes, and they do this through the principles of dharma, which is to mean righteousness, and karma to mean action. They would also use the practice of shanti, which means peace, to restore connection. In China, the practice of, and I hope I am not mispronouncing this, of feng shui, meaning the rectification of names, oversaw a reconciliation process based upon Confucianist philosophy. In Japan, there was restorative practices known as jiri, meaning obligation, implying that there was a moral obligation that followed in accordance with Buddhist teachings that meant to exercise compassion through the making of amends. So in general, there are unquantifiable examples of historical models of the restorative paradigm scattered by space, but still connected in spirit. However, in my particular perspective, I think it's of critical importance that we begin this research where all of human history must begin, which is in Africa, the cradle of civilization. As perhaps the eldest axiology of restorative practices comes in the form of the Ma'atic system. So according to the activist, the speaker, the author, and intellectual Dr. Maulana Karenga, he writes, as moral thought and practice, Ma'at is a way of rightness defined especially by the practice of the 7 cardinal virtues of truth, justice, harmony, reciprocity, balance, and order. So kind of following in alignment with investigating into ancient Kemet, or its later Greek given name, Egypt. In the 20th century BCE, before Common Era, a judge from the 11th dynasty of the Kemetic Empire had essentially confessed that I have established Ma'at throughout my entire career. I have judged according to Ma'at in such a way that both parties, offender and victim, have walked away with peaceful hearts. So judging according to Ma'at meant restoring harmony at the most axiological level through a culturally oriented lens in order to evict Ifset, which was chaos, right? It should also be noted that circle symbolism, circle, which is the key ingredient of the restorative paradigm, was also of critical importance to Egyptian society as it was communicated through language, through gestures, images, and words. Later, inside of West Africa and pre-colonial Ghana, we can talk about the Kima system, which was an ancestor to the restorative paradigm, in which community members, whenever they had conflicts, they would defer to the chiefs, and they would take part in sort of coming together as a community and discussing a mediation process that could eventually lead to some level of reconciliation. To offer an example through cultural context, if perhaps some of the highest violations were committed in taking of a person's life, they would try to remedy this process and interrupt this cycle of violence by perhaps encouraging family members from the offender's family to now substitute in place of the person whose life was lost within the Kima policies and procedures. Simultaneously, if the Kima system was unable to succeed at times due to the severity of the offense, they would implement the Posiga system, which served as a spiritual alternative, and which they would and it would involve the invocation of ancestral and divine forces according to their names, as if one does research and their own cursory examinations into African society, they would understand the importance of Ren, or the name, within the cultural context. And to swear an oath upon a name is to swear an oath upon one's own spiritual being. In South Africa, there's a cultural philosophy of Ubuntu. Ubuntu connotes solidarity. The philosophy of Ubuntu is expressed in many languages. It's also known as Utu, but retains the same principal meaning. In Siswati, there's a saying, Umuntu and Gamuntu and Gabantu, which means a person is a person for other people. This humanizing doctrine was important in resolving the trauma of oppression, especially following apartheid. So the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was mandated directly following apartheid to address the victims of the regime while also attempting to grant amnesty to offenders who had confessed their crimes between 1960 and 1994. So that's North and West Africa. I told y'all I'd be long-winded, so I'm gonna go now over to East Africa. So in pre-colonial Kenya, the Akikuyu people handled conflicts within the use of family, clan, or the council of elders. They had the Kamba system, the Kikuyu system. So the Kamba system would essentially focus directly on this hierarchical structure. So very similar to the Kima system, what was practiced was there was a clan head in which it would typically be the head or patriarch, matriarch of your family. Typically it was matriarch, as they were typically matriarchal systems. And that family head would then convene with the family head of the respective family members, respective families, the offenders' families, and they would try to solve a mediation process. If that was unsuccessful, then they would invite the elders from the village, typically would be a council of women, to then therefore facilitate another process. Another system was the Kikuyu system, in which it was particularly directed towards land disputes. This is also has a level of spiritual importance, as there was the planting of the placenta at birth, in which you would give your placenta into the earth, and it would show your connected harmony with nature. And so land, should it be disputed, it was typically documented by extended family members that were often known as the embodied, and through blood ties, they would try to commune around land ownership, and such. And so between South, between East, between West, between North, we can see similarities and consistencies within the same model and same systems. And that's all.
Thank you, Siddiqui. And we'll move to you, Christian.
Yamanak, and thank you to Kay and Siddiqui for all that you have shared in response to this question. And I don't want to cover the same points as to the tributary streams that has led to restorative justice and informed restorative justice, and the wonderful and really global perspective you offered, Siddiqui, around the different articulations of principles and values that are really embedded in restorative justice. So I'll focus on the deep roots of restorative justice in Indigenous peacemaking. Many global Indigenous communities have a long-standing history of living in alignment with principles and values that have now become popularized as restorative justice in Western approaches to criminal justice system reform or criminal justice reform. Indigenous peacemaking, which has recently was recently talked about at the BC Provincial Symposium on the Decolonizing Restorative Justice panel, is inseparable from the restorative healing practices that are lived every day in connection to oneself, to community and nature, according to many Indigenous communities and traditions and ways of life. So for example, in the Philippines, for the Kalinga people, the practice of puchon is more than a conflict resolution practice. It is tied to all ways of life, including their political system. And so I want to highlight the principle interconnection, because this value and principle is really, really, since the beginning, when I entered restorative justice, that actually was a value and principle that really spoke to me. And it spoke to me. I really love what Iman said earlier, like the subconscious and the conscious, and it's both. And so, but interconnection is a really central core for many, many different Indigenous worldviews. Interconnection is a central core of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis worldviews and ways of knowing. Some First Nations refer to a phrase, all my relations, which reflects the principle of everything in the universe is connected. The all my relations philosophy and practice teaches a lot about relating to others and to ourselves. In Tagalog, one of the languages spoken in the Philippines, the word kapwa refers to the deep meaning of sensing oneself and others. In Hawaiian culture, the greeting aloha refers to the principle of being a part of all and all being a part of me, as described by Kirby Rule. My good friend Sky Bowen and Siddiqui just talked about it, shared with me about the concept of Ubuntu as the African understanding of humanity and humanness, which I think is from the book Ubuntu and the Reconstitution of Community, edited by Kenyan literary scholar James Ogudi. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu connects Ubuntu to the saying, I am because we are. So this idea of interconnection in many cultural and Indigenous communities exists as a principle, a value, a mindset, a practice, a way of life. And so I think that all of that, what I've just shared, is not often talked about and portrayed in a lot of the current iteration of restorative justice. The thing that I discovered that spoke to me in the Western iteration of restorative justice is that community is described and its role in responding to when harm and conflict occurs, the values of accountability and responsibility taking, and the overall goal of healing harm, offering both an individual process and collective process. That's what really spoke to me. And that to me is what links to interconnection. But I think the deep value that stretches across many cultural and indigenous communities of interconnection that seems to be a real foundation for restorative justice in its Western iteration. It's very process focused, very systems focused. Whereas from an indigenous cultural worldview, it's a way of life. It's the way we are at the dinner table, the way we are with our neighbors, because our neighbors could probably our family that have lived alongside each other for many, many years. And so so there's, I guess, a tension in how I learned about it, how subconsciously I engage with restorative justice, or what is called restorative justice here, and the way I came to learn about it, more consciously through reading the books that are published and academically, and what's taught in the institutions that exist here.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. The beauty of being on a panel with such esteemed and brilliant colleagues is that it curtails, well, not curtails, but at least refines the degree to which you have to respond to certain things when you go last. So I'm grateful for all that's been shared. I would like to add a different perspective in relationship to the question itself. Since the question was, for other purposes, what are my perceptions of the origins and additionally its portrayal in media, trainings, etc. We could literally, and I mean quite literally, spend this entirety of the time dealing solely with the connections to these varied cultural origins that both Kay, Siddiqui, and Christiane have already shared with us, right? And we could add obviously an awful lot more to that. And we could just spend the time on that. But then the question for me is what are we actually trying to understand in this question about determining the origins of a thing that's utilized in a colonized space, right? What are we really trying to understand in relationship to that? And so if our response to that is so that we can increase our scholarship and our awareness, and we can add on to all these things that we want to utilize in a fair, if you will, process and manner in regards to how we address some of the horrible, unfortunately, relational issues that we have within the world, then I have to raise a question around why we're investigating that, right? My response, excuse me, in relationship to my perceptions of the origin is simply what has been stated in varied ways, and that is it's been colonized. That's what my perception is. It's been colonized in a number of different ways from a number of different people. And if I need to be a little bit clearer about what I'm saying, it's been stolen from, that is, disregarding the cultural origins of anyone that's been named or that has not been named, and then utilizing something specifically as a practice, at least under the guise of something that can be that becomes valuable, for us in order to be able to deal with systems of colonization and the structures around it are producing in and of themselves. And so for me, what becomes important is when we talk about how it's portrayed in the media, how it's utilized in trainings, and however else we may come about it, I think that if we're being honest about our intentions of, for all relative purposes, reclamation or decolonization or dealing with, for all relative purposes, forming some way of truly making things right and or better in the context of knowing that we're dealing with systems that have co-opted a variety of ways of people's lives, then we've got to develop some sense of understanding of how do we meet the need of truly being able to honor and allow folks to develop and grow into their own empowerment when we are trying to deal with these large societal issues. If we're talking about being restorative, in the sense of the criminal legal system, I think, and trust me, I've worked in that space as well. Hoping that I can do one little thing here or one little thing there to be able to impact somebody's life, perhaps prevent them from being incarcerated unnecessarily, or perhaps to prevent them from, dealing with an undue fine unnecessarily. And still, we're talking about doing this alongside a system that we know is inherently antithetical to what we're trying to produce in the context of being restorative. And so I think it requires us, or it at least it offers, it suggests, excuse me, that we should raise a question around not just what our perception is in terms of how it's being utilized, but then where and are we willing to make the necessary changes in order for it to truly be able to, for lack of a better term, live out in its own value? How can we be restorative in a space where we know that despite whatever it is that we say or whatever it is that we do, that the most that we can do is to provide space for folks to be in dialogue with folks who have been harmed, who have been harmed, as opposed to restructuring the things that might have led to the needs that precipitated the harm, restructuring the things that might lead to how we meet those needs that may have come after the harm, and restructuring society in a way that people, for all relative purposes, are able to live and interact with each other in a manner that is far more in alignment with the type of community building and healing and strengthening that we're talking about developing. That becomes a more not so much interesting, but a more important question for me when I think about how we're utilizing these tools. I see them utilized in institutions outside of the criminal legal system. We utilize them in schools. We utilize them in all these varied ways without understanding that it's at the base and at its core, there needs to be a sense of understanding of how we are in agreement to developing as community. How are we in agreement with how we want to, for our relative purposes, interact with each other, how we're going to function, how are we going to deal with things as harm arises, and understand that those institutions are tied to that. It's not the other way around. The institutions are a part of community. They're not some microcosm of how the world runs. And then as a result, these things that need to spread out, into the community. No, the institutions need to be in alignment with the community itself. And so if we continue to utilize restorative practices only as a way to be able to deal with problems organizationally, I'm concerned that, at least my perspective is that I'm concerned that it will provide challenges that'll make it a little bit, not so much insurmountable, but it'll definitely keep us running into specific walls when it comes to trying to understand why certain outcomes are still prevalent within specific spaces. If we don't deal with the direct and core issues around why people are still how people, excuse me, are still impacted by the colonial structure in and of itself, then I think we create problems when we say we're presenting alternative, if you will, to how to work in that space, when the space in and of itself and the ways in which people interact within that space are also influencing how we apply that particular alternative.
Thank you all. And thank you, Iman, for a beautiful segue and connection to our third question. And you are scheduled first for this next round. So I certainly invite you to add to that. And then we'll move to Christian and then Siddiqui and Kay. And the third question is really very specifically about the impact of the colonization of the origins of the work. And as I said, Iman, I certainly hear very clearly your beginning to really connect us to that deep consideration. So I'll turn it to you again, to add to in whatever way you believe you need to.
Indeed, I appreciate that. What initially comes up for me is just a realization that as we are attempting for our relative purposes, and I want to be clear, because it may seem in some ways that the way that I'm responding might be somehow resistant or even anti the use of restorative practices in this societal context, and that's not the case. However, I think that it becomes important for us to really, really understand what we're talking about in terms of colonization in and of itself, and what its impact has been more broadly in the sense, excuse me, of people, the way that they, for lack of a better term, show up every day in their normal lives within their respective communities, and how they show up for their family, their friends, their community members, their colleagues, etc. The impact has been, unfortunately, that we have gone from, as again, as my colleagues have so beautifully described, systems where foundationally the way that we live, the way that we interact with each other, have gone from a communal context to an individualized context. And because of that, to try then to insert or to infuse practices that are fundamentally grounded in the communal context, creates, for lack of a better term, a contradiction, if you will, in terms of then understanding more clearly, how do we apply this? The reality is that in every space where people have been colonized, and there's no historical exception that I'm aware of, if there is one, I'd love to hear it. But in every space where people have been colonized, the reality is that those who then live under conditions of oppression have been completely stripped and removed away from who they were in terms of their indigenous mindset, their indigenous ways of life, their indigenous ways of being, or there is consistent action to attempt to keep them forcefully moved away from those ways of life, right? And so if we're talking about then the impact of what that does for someone who then in turn has to live not only then in the context of enduring the oppression, but then we're introducing a set of practices to suggest that somehow we can utilize these practices in order to make things right, to make things better in a space where we generally don't have the power, or I should say that our power is suppressed in a way tremendously. Then we've got to really consider that not only do we have to do away with those things that maintain the levels or the aspects of colonization, but we've got to really be able to figure out, I would say, both internally in terms of the respective groups that are oppressed, as well as those, for our relative purposes, who are responsible for the oppressive conditions. What then are we attempting to make right or better? What are we genuinely attempting to make right or better under those circumstances? And if we can't answer that in a context that allows everyone, for our relative purposes, to be who they are, and to, for lack of a better term, walk away or to walk into wherever they want to within the rest of the world with the ability to be able to enforce to reinforce that in terms of how they show up in the world, then I think that we, in some ways perhaps are wasting time, but more importantly, that we are spinning wheels that will only get us to a point where we make some sense of things that can be perhaps captured in an intellectual sense, in an academic sense, in what people perceive to be a scholarly sense, but not in a sense of how we utilize it practically or pragmatically.
Thank you, Aman. Christian?
I was snapping, Iman. Well, I really want to express deep gratitude for you introducing into our conversation the importance of being able to tie in the history of colonization and why that's important in our analysis of the way restorative justice is portrayed. The impacts of the inaccurate and incomplete portrayal of the origins of RJ can't be discussed, as Iman just expressed, without acknowledging the strategies of colonization. There has been extraction of indigenous knowledge and practices that have been used to inform RJ while erasing its indigenous roots. And then there's exploitation of these practices in colonial systems, which result in co-option that does not serve indigenous people in these systems, nor does it serve Black and brown folks. The co-option also shows up in how restorative justice, despite its origins, can be unsafe spaces and processes for Indigenous, Black, and Brown folks, particularly when it's around racial harm and many other forms of oppression. It shows up as a tension between values and practice. Going back to the principle and value of interconnection, I once was told by a very well-known restorative justice expert when I asked to join a space offered at an event that they were hosting. And it was a space that that was being hosted and held for Black, Indigenous, and folks of color. And they came up and said, no, you can't join that group because they're just talking about justice work that they're doing. And that has nothing to do with identity. And it caused me to pause. And it was this moment of like, wow, there's still spaces in restorative justice where there's a lack of recognition or acknowledgement or awareness of the intersection between identity and justice. Because for many folks who are racialized, historically marginalized, they are absolutely intersected. I do this work so that my people and people from cultural communities can also access spaces that are mindful of identity and ways in which we not only talk about identity but celebrate it, and also have an opportunity to for that reclamation for that process. And so for me, that has been a real challenge, is that in this lack of, I guess, acknowledgement or awareness around identity and justice being at a really important intersection. And what's the cause of that? Well, I think the cause is that that there are folks who go and access restorative justice, and it is a very assimilatory process. There are folks who maybe it would be more meaningful if they had a chance to speak their own language in a restorative process, to be able to practice ceremony in that restorative process, to be able to request for their elder from their community. And so when are we going to have those questions? When are we going to have those considerations be prioritized in restorative justice? When are we going to have like additional, where it isn't just at an interpersonal level? I think restorative justice also, it fails to have a conversation from a both and. It situates a lot of discussions at the interpersonal level, which is why when we're talking about racial harm, it really fails to be able to hold space for that deep conversation about systemic harms, about institutional change. And so I think that there's a lot of impact to the practice, to the spaces and the processes that we are trying to cultivate in restorative justice. And we cannot make those changes without recognition of the colonial strategies that have impacted the way restorative justice is currently practiced. And we also can't move forward without acknowledging the white supremacy culture, the system that really is embedded in a lot of the ideologies that inform the process and the ways of being in this practice. I'll leave it at that.
Difficult to take up this question after such beautiful responses, but I'll try my best all the same. So in this contemporary moment, the conversation of colonization, particularly in regards to the system of racism that we are currently experiencing, known as white supremacy, it has co-opted and credited both punitive the punitive paradigm and the restorative paradigm to both be productions of the West. So albeit there are mentions of restorative justice being related to elements of indigenous work, however, the overwhelming assumption is that restorative practices essentially emerged out of a vacuum, and through the powerful work of an individual known as Howard Zer, it has been allowed to exist and go forward. However, these cultural assumptions, they provide dangerous misconceptions about every other cultural group that essentially exists on the periphery of the European society. So just to first confront the punitive paradigm, as that is indeed the system by which we are living, and as Aman has already expressed, it is interwoven into our school system, our education system, or rather our miseducation system, as Carter G. Woodson would put it. It is inserted into our criminal justice system, and it has inserted itself into our economic system. The school to prison pipeline exists within the miseducation system to remove Black youth from academic environments and prepare them for incarceration prematurely. Racial inequalities within the capitalist system have led to a loss of employment, to loss of housing, civil rights, and public benefits. Punitive criminal policies that continue to over-incarcerate Black men in particular has produced overcrowded prisons with insufficient resources that consistently fail to address the problem of crime, gang violence, and of course, recidivism. So on the other hand, that was just in discussion of the punitive system. So on the other hand, in regards to restorative practices, when perceived as a white invention, it supports a racial narrative that is especially damaging, as the impact of colonization is in many ways and has already been expressed to be an incalculable sort of endeavor. The hegemonic structure of the West would lead us to believe that the same system that is directly liable for the universalization of the punitive system is simultaneously responsible for the invention and discovery of a restorative system. Not only does this perpetuate the problematic burden of leadership unto Western society, but it also makes invisible the indefatigable work of the ancestors who gifted this world with techniques of conflict resolution. Furthermore, what this does is this confuses Black and brown people into an unhealthy dependence upon the cultural practices that are only generated by the West. Lastly, we should move away from this individualistic practice of crediting one man for the development of an entire paradigm, when these ancient practices have been preserved and continue to be protected by collectives, especially since this is collective-centered. We must directly address this notion of invisibility syndrome, as it has led to confusion, it has led to this lack of engagement, and ultimately separation of self. We talked earlier about our very humanity being reduced, our very ability to exist and engage as being removed. And that is in what is regarded in the Afrocentric paradigm as a lack of ontological unity, as a lack of unity with the nature of our being, right? We cannot be ourselves if we do not know ourselves, and we cannot know ourselves as long as we celebrate those who oppress us. And the cure to our oppression cannot be found in the same system that generates our oppression, right? We must search within ourselves to find out the answers to our own particular and specific cultural situations and circumstances. And with that, I'll just pass it over.
Mary Jo, I just want to do a time check. How long are we going?
I think we're good to everyone. So, our general time frame, for questions, I think can still hold. Okay, we're good.
I can't separate the question of the impact of colonization on on the origins from the general question of the broader impact of colonization on everything, which I heard Aman speak to. I think colonization impacts everything, shapes how we see the world, how we interpret the world, our expectations of the world. I am unconsciously programmed by colonization. And I personally believe that colonization is harmful to everyone. It's more harmful to some people than others, but that as a fundamental way of humans living together, that it's ultimately harmful to everyone. When you think specifically about origins, like looking at the circle process that I practice. Colonization tried to eradicate that form, attempted to completely destroy that practice that we're now turning to try to salvage our species, and rejected the wisdom represented by this way of being together. I think that in that broader sense, the impact of colonization has been to create the creation by humans of a world that will lead to the destruction of our own species if we don't reconceptualize who we are as human beings. And so for me, the decolonization in some form is absolutely necessary for our survival as a species. Thank you.
Thank you all. This question is sort of an extension of what you've been sharing. And what we're asking is, what should we do? We have this as practitioners, as individuals representing institutions who are adopting restorative practices, who are looking for ways to implement restorative justice in their systems. What reparative actions should institutions and those working at institutions that have been complicit in the colonization of the origins of restorative justice do to move forward? And the order of this, I think we're finishing with Siddiqui. If I can call on you to go first, and then we'll move from Siddiqui to Aman, then to Kay, and Christiane will finish up with you.
So thank you once again. This question is, I think sort of the penultimate objective for us coming together is to sort of brainstorm and think about the future, as that is where the ongoing direction of this work will lead us. I think that the answers to this problem are multifold, just as the institution of colonization itself is multifold, and will require a lot more than even the solutions that we will propose inside of this conversation. This will be a question that our children will continue to think about in our absence. I think one of the foremost issues that is worthy of discussion is naming and crediting specific cultures for the practices that they originate. For instance, restorative questions that we engage in can be directly attributed to the colon response practices of our ancestors in the continent. To ask a question for the collective, to allow them to pontificate around that, to allow them to come back and engage in a level of emotional vocabulary around that, is directly related to the same sort of cultural nuances and practices that we would engage in circles as we came together to sit around a fire and read a scroll, and to engage in a level of reconciliation in West Africa between Ago and Ame being, terms of important usage in West African culture. Similarly, the usage of collective movement and voices inside of the circle process is directly attributed to many different indigenous and African cultures, as well as Asiatic cultures around the world. The circle organization, I spoke briefly earlier about the symbolism of the circle inside of ancient Kemetic culture, about the usage of the hieroglyphic Ren, which is a hieroglyph meaning to enchant, to encircle, but later became that meaning etymologically shifted to mean to enchant, to apply a spiritual sort of nuance to the meaning of a circle. Also, the usage of talking pieces, which would previously be considered in many ways by Western society as idolatry, and the usage of icons and modes of being within circles is directly related to those practices as well. So naming those and crediting those cultures. I think also what we need to do is we need to continue to highlight and promotes those culturally affirming organizations. So, of course, I'm going to give some credence. On the East Coast, we got Akobin, LLC. On the West Coast, I know that there's been some good work performed by Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, or RJOY, as they have committed to, I believe, creating land or rather, holding stewardship over land and inviting students to engage and work directly in harmony with nature. In Samoa, there's a program called Samoa Restorative Practices, and in Fiji, there's also a program called Fiji Restorative Justice. So looking outside of ourselves to find those answers are critical and necessary. To that point also of youth, I believe that it is critical, most critical, that we develop youth-centered programs, as they are the future of this world. If we stand upon the shoulders of our ancestors, then they stand upon our shoulders, and the world rests upon their own. And so we must continue to develop youth programs that are committed to answering this work, as they will continue to develop this in our absence. And as we move forward, part of the conceptual apparatus that we talk about a lot inside of conscious communities is this notion of having a center and understanding your location, mentally, geographically, physically. Previously, we talked about our experiences within a system that is dominated by punitive practices and is oppressive towards people of color. So how do we locate ourselves, relocate our cultures, our cultural roots, and what practices we are engaging in, and how do we properly relocate those across time and space to their accurate sources, and attribute a level of respect to the cultures that promoted them and created them. And so I think those are only four, rather, of the proposed solutions to begin this process.
Ditto. No, I'm joking. Yeah, what should the institutions do, right? I think that for me, what becomes really, really important, if we're going to answer this with any degree of, authenticity, and I would add integrity, is what is the motive of the institution in the context of applying any of this to begin with? If the institution isn't genuinely willing to, one, concede power, to really be able to restructure the way that it applies its practices and get rid of people who are continuing to adhere to what they know as blatantly racist, blatantly oppressive practices and adhere to these policies. If the institution isn't genuinely willing to do that, then the only response I have is to get out of the way. That's what they can do. Get out of the way. Like we're wasting time trying to answer questions for what people can do rather than allowing the people to be the ones to be able to, as I think each of my colleagues in some way have said at some point, to be the ones to truly derive the solutions that are needed in order to get us out of the conditions that we're in towards truly a liberatory end. I have no, even if we can't identify and be honest about what the contradictions are that are present in a criminal legal system that says, hey, we want to use the, I can't, forgive me, I can't help but laugh because I think it's just, it's laughable. But if we can't genuinely in the context, excuse me, of a criminal legal system, say, hey, we want to apply these practices and try to make things better and see, look what we're doing. We're doing something that is going to help and be of benefit or whatever it is, nonsense that they would say. And yet we know still that the disproportional amount of people who are of African descent and of other communities that are non-white are still those who highly occupy the prison systems, and the prison industrial complex in general is completely, unfortunately, saturated with higher proportions of those people than they are folks who identify as white. We know that this disproportionality exists in various spheres of human interaction, from what people continue to call, and I still don't understand why, a justice system, when they continue to exist in what people continue to call, and I don't understand why, an educational system. They exist in the context of how we interact in relationship to maintaining our health and well-being. They exist in the context of how we interact and engage socially. They exist in the context of, obviously, as I think Siddiqui pointed this out early on, how we interact and engage economically. And so it's a joke, in my opinion, to solely suggest, and I recognize that the question didn't stem from that. I want to be clear. I don't. This is not you or Mary or Pat me suggesting that you all suggested this, but it's a joke, in my opinion, to consider that institutionally we're going to do anything to move the needle forward if those kinds of serious changes aren't willing to be made. We can hope for the best, in the sense that, as I think I alluded to a bit earlier, that a couple of individuals perhaps might fare better in terms of certain outcomes, that we keep trying to, what is it, play the line between the restorative paradigm and the punitive paradigm when we're engaging in dealing with harms and things that arise. But ultimately, this is a question, in my opinion, for the people. What are we going to do? How do we truly engage in ways that will counter the impact, if you will, of these structures and systems and whatever other isms we want to recognize that have had centuries long impact, excuse me, on our lives? And how do we then turn that around in a way that we can hopefully, as Sadiqi's young ones come forward into the world, and anyone else for that matter who may be engaged in that form of continuing of life, that they encounter a world, and they encounter, if you will, a community structure that is truly built on understanding and recognizing and honoring each other's humanity in a way that we don't have to continue to rail, if you will, against these systems of oppression. Otherwise, yeah, if it's left up to the institution, we'll be having the same conversation in another 100 years.
Thank you so much for those reflections. I'm a circle practitioner, so it's my solution to everything. I think we need to sit together. We need to speak truth as we understand it. We need to listen to the truth of others, nurture our common ground, acknowledge harms, and co-create the future that's not based on a hierarchy of worthiness. And I think that needs to be deeply rooted in interconnectedness. It is the concept that for me is most central, as Christiane mentioned, that once we really understand our interconnectedness, we understand that we can never benefit at the expense of someone else. And if we were all to live as though we can never benefit at the expense of someone else, it would be a completely different world. And that I think that because colonization is deeply embedded in our mindset, that we have to work at the mindset level, that any process can be distorted to serve the opposite ends from its original intention, and that we need to sit together and have lots and lots of conversations about what are the fundamental underlying assumptions we are carrying, that not that we intentionally chose in many cases, but that are programmed into us in the culture that we've grown into, and I think especially for white people. And that we need to seek collective wisdom based on lived experience, that's the way forward for us in spaces that are open to all voices and treat everyone with dignity and respect. And I don't know how to do that at scale, but I think that if we do it enough at the micro level, we'll begin to figure out how to do that at scale. Thank you so much, Christiane.
How do I go last after such amazing words and wisdom? Agimanak Unai, and thank you, Iman, Sadiqi, and Kay. I'm going to reiterate, I think understanding colonization and acknowledging institutions' foundations on colonialism and white supremacy culture is important, because we cannot change what we do not acknowledge. I think those are the wise words of a dear friend, Erica Little Wolf. And also because these institutions cannot assess, analyze, critique the ways in which colonialism and white supremacy culture show up in their policies and processes and spaces. And I think comprehending how colonial strategies like extraction, erasure, exploitation, how they're exercised in institutions, and how at an ideological level, colonial and white supremacy culture drives co-option, I think we cannot really, that to me is a foundational place to begin. And from there, yeah, I really love, a co-liberatory framework. Engaging in authentic and meaningful consultative and collaborative processes and practices when we're reimagining and rebuilding these institutions is important. It's, I think having a power analysis would also be crucial and central to not co-opting restorative justice, restorative practices. And I say this because I wanna acknowledge that there are folks maybe in the audience who are at different parts of the journey, but grappling with questions such as the ones that Erica Little Wolf, Michelle Armster, and I offered in our chapter, Burn the Bridge, in the book Colorizing Restorative Justice would be, I think, a good practice to engage in. I'll share the questions with you, like how are the issues of race, class, and gender recognized or not in restorative justice? And what is the cost of not recognizing these issues? What practices within restorative justice perpetuate colonization and oppression? And how do power and privilege impact restorative justice processes? I think I wish for more spaces in which we can have these very difficult conversations. And I just don't think there's too many spaces that offer that. I think that if restorative justice lives up to its promise, then we should be able to have spaces in which, it's not always about Black, Indigenous folks of color to be courageous. It's not always going to be that. I would love for for white folks to come into that space and be courageous, lean into discomfort, and have those conversations with us. And in the just leaning into and looking back to the wisdom of a friend, Harley Eagle, he always talks about the colonization that happened in Europe. And I think for folks here on Turtle Island, you learned it from somewhere. That colonization history is something that you experience yourself, and it's maybe you've come so far away from it that you don't remember. But I guess it would be wonderful to sit and have a conversation, a real, truly meaningful conversation of colonization and how that's continued on. And it's interesting because a famous quote in restorative justice is hurt people hurt people. So when you put colonization with that quote, I think there's a real important conversation to be had.
Thank you all so much. I'd like to continue the conversation, but we're getting close to the end of our time together. I wonder, Kaylee, if there's time for a question. I saw one come through.
We do have one question.
Thank
and
you.
I have it here, and I think people have, if not yet, noticed certainly some very interesting and supportive comments in the chat as well. But the question that came for any one of the panelists is, could you elaborate on the relationship of the principles of Ubuntu and Sawubona to the practice of healing circles and Afro-Indigenous origins of restorative practices? That's from the question box there. Is there a way to answer that, anyone?
There definitely is. I'm gonna leave that though to Professor Muhammad as opposed to.
I can speak to Ubuntu, but your scholarship on Sawubona is a lot stronger than mine. So maybe we could both tackle it. So just to give some sources, if um if you're interested in sort of exploring on your own journey into a little bit more into connection and relationship between Ubuntu and restorative philosophy, there's a text called Reconstructing Restorative Justice Philosophy by Dr. Vassal, I can't pronounce his last name, and Theograph Realities. In the 14th chapter of that edition, it's called The African Concept of Ubuntu and Restorative Justice by Marie-Lise Schoeman, in which she directly discusses the interconnectedness between Ubuntu and healing circles, particularly its usage inside of South Africa was much more in kind of discussing and re-understand, or rather reinterpreting restorative justice through the lens of a concept that was culturally significant to the people and collective. Ubuntu is in itself an expression of our humanity. And to follow in alignment with what our humanity is, it is also a liberatory process as it regenerates and reconnects you with a bit of what you were prior to the infraction or harm that has been done, and rather than problematizing you, as a lot of what the punitive system can do, and kind of saying, because you have committed this, according to the just world theory, bad people do bad things. So because you have committed this action, this harm, you're now a bad person. It separates you from that ideology and reconnects you to a sense of humanity inside of your collective. So kind of coming up, we have a holiday, Kwanzaa. The third principle in the Nguzo Saba on Kwanzaa is Ujima, cooperative working responsibility. There's a lot of synchronicity between Ubuntu and Ujima, and just understanding and kind of recognizing our relationship to engaging in engaging conflicts when it is between our community.
No doubt, no doubt. In terms of Sawubona in and of itself is a greeting. And what I'd like to just offer is, and I don't say this as a way to kind of cop out, everything that Siddiqui just said is applied and applicable, excuse me, in the context of utilizing this greeting. The greeting in and of itself, in a loose context, means I see you. And so in different parts of Southern Africa, within various cultures, it's utilized, of course, the way we would say, hey, hello, how you doing, what's up, or whatever it is that we say, right? But to be extracted from that is this importance of understanding the recognition of one's humanity in the context of how we interact with each other. And so when we say Sawubona, it's not just I see you, it's we see you. It's we value you, it's we respect you, right? In the context of understanding that the individual, of course, is connected to history, to a family, to a community, to a legacy, to ancestors and the like, and that all of those things are present in the individual as we interact with each other. And so it's not just Amon per se speaking to you saying, hey, what's up or how you doing? It's no, I recognize and honor your humanity in the fact that we in this moment have the opportunity to engage with each other. And so if we don't understand recognizing each other's humanity as central to understanding what it means to be restorative, then perhaps we might need to go back, to some of the, or, to some 101 or whatever it is that helped inform us in terms of the idea of restorative practices. But that's my response.
And if I could also, we flowing together, brother. You speaking of language, a good professor of mine left me with this quote. He said, "Language is an inventory of a people's culture and a witness to people's experiences." And so, in our investigation of language, it really helps us to orient ourselves to understanding of how people exist and kind of understanding from their own lens. It's very much like glasses. You take glasses, you receive different prescriptions each year. You need a stronger prescription until eventually, when you take the glasses off, it's very hard to see the world without them. That is our culture. That is how we have acclimated ourselves, our vision. And a very similar saying, a greeting inside of the Maasai in Kenya is Kasiri and Ngera. How are the children doing? Very similar to in Swahili, Habari gani? What is the news? So these greetings, these ways in which we even speak of ourselves as a collective within our language, it informs how we engage as a culture.
Thank you so much, Siddiqui and Aman, for addressing that question. I just want to note that the same person that posed the question later on said the panelists have already deeply and profoundly addressed my question, but thank you for even giving more, which I think, Mary Jo, do you want me to hand it off to you?
Christiane, I saw that you unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to express my appreciation and gratitude around the conversation that just transpired between Siddiqui and Iman, just vibing off each other to answer the question. And I guess for us to highlight like the importance of language. I really love us speaking, the different values from these beautiful different cultures. And in a way, for me, whenever we speak about language, when we start to bring in all of these beautiful words that have meaning to us culturally and collectively with our communities, it's a reclamation. And I'm so appreciative of that because I think one of the things that we don't talk about is language is also a colonial occupation. And that truly is very present in restorative justice. So I just want to say thank you to you both. I think what we witness here is, a beautiful moment of reclamation when we're speaking words like Ubuntu, when we're speaking words like Kapwa. I think that it's a really important moment to celebrate.
Thank you. Well, we are approaching the end of our time together, which went very quickly for me and in a very rich way. I'm grateful for everyone who is here as part of the panel, those behind the scenes who have been helping with technology, and all of those who are here listening and learning. So we are indeed very grateful. I'm humbled. And when I have experiences like this, I see them as a next step in this journey, right? Not the end, not, oh, I've learned something and now I can. It is about moving on. And I so appreciate all of our preparation for this as well as today. So thank you. Pat, did you have anything? And I did want to ask if anybody had any last thoughts, because we do have a little buffer. Anyone?
Mary Jo, I would just second your gratitude. Mary Jo and I had this wonderful opportunity of meeting these individuals and us having a conversation last month. So I feel so grateful for that and for your conversation today. And just want you to know, if you haven't had a chance to look in the chat, that there's much gratitude being expressed by all of our attendees, and looking for ways to connect with you and looking for resources that you would recommend. And so we'll try to do that as part of the forum following this panel. But I do want to give the panelists a moment if there's anything that you'd like to share before we part ways today. I think you have absolutely shared enough. So thank you. Thank you all so much. And as Mary Jo said, thank you to everyone who's attended today's session. Very much appreciate you being part of the conversation. And Kay, Aman, Siddiqui, Christiane, thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us here for this and for providing us with so much to think about and to celebrate. Take good care.
Thank you all. Be well.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Mhm.